prospect of easy money laying around brought people flocking in. So another example of this is Groupon. So Groupon had this interesting idea, but it had no intellectual property to protect it. And the internet has made it incredibly easy for people to enter and do something like what Groupon does. And so they were just deluged with competitors very, very quickly. And so by the time they IPO'd, they were hardly able to raise any money. Another version of this is that if one firm is using a more efficient technology, very often other firms will want to enter and switch to that technology. So if you think about the first smartphones, they all had this clunky BlackBerry design, right? And then Apple came in with the iPhone, and suddenly there were a zillion people making touchscreen smartphones. Now, Apple got a temporary advantage and managed to make a little bit of money, but pretty soon they were having trouble making a lot of money on their phones because they were facing so much competition. Anytime a firm is making losses, on the other hand, you should expect it to exit the market. Now, there's been a paradox in recent years that seems to have really challenged this concept. And I want to read you a little bit from an Onion article talking about this. So I don't know if anyone's seen this Onion article. Has anyone been to Edible Arrangements or had the pleasure of receiving one of their gorgeous bouquets of fruit? So this is a place that produces ugly bouquets of flower made out of bad fruit. So it neither is good to eat, nor is it good to look at. And this is actually, this story was written from a town that is important to both me and Jacob. So they write, upending more than 2 centuries of free market theory, leading economists across the globe announced that Thursday that fundamental principles of capitalism had been irrefutably disproved by the continued existence of the designer fruit basket company Edible Arrangements. According to experts, the Connecticut-based franchise, which arranges skewered pieces of fruit into displays vaguely resembling floral bouquets, has defied all modern economic models, expanding continuously for the past decade despite its complete lack of any discernible consumer appeal. In theory, the market should have done away with Edible Arrangements long ago. So this is sort of funny, but the theory that it's talking about is this idea that firms that have no appeal are going to exit the market, right? OK. My guess is that it's a money laundering arrangement. And most economists, when they see something like that, think that it's probably a money laundering thing. So in the long run, therefore, supply curve should be flat at the minimum of the average cost curve, where the average cost curve is defined over all possible technologies that the firm could use. So last class, we had that big long-run average supply curve. We should be at the minimum point of that curve in the long term if all firms can enter the industry, because they'll just enter to the point where every firm is operating at the cheapest possible part, right? OK. So however, it's not entirely obvious that it will be completely flat if there's a small number of firms. And if entry occurs at a non-trivial fraction of the total quantity in the industry. And the reason is that the next firm, I guess this is probably the best curve, the best example, the next firm is not going to want to come in to the industry until the price has risen to the point where that firm can actually make positive profits. So you get this sort of thing where as the price rises, or as the quantity rises, it takes less and less of a deviation of price up to get the next firm to enter and therefore bring the supply curve back down again. So you get something like this, where the bigger the market size, the bigger the quantity, the closer you get to it being totally flat, and there's actually these kinks. But remember, this is only relevant to the extent that any firm is a significant fraction of the total quantity in the market. And to the extent that they are, we probably don't want to be using a competitive model. So again, in competitive models, these problems don't arise. And in general, there's sort of a broader lesson to take away from this, I think, which is that most of the things that make competitive models complicated or confusing, or not like many of the things that are not like the standard world, are driven by the fact that you shouldn't really be using a competitive model to study that situation anyways, because there's like these big lumpy firms. OK. So this process of competition that drives prices down to cost can be inhibited by policy, either by government intervention or by private violence. And these impediments to firms coming in and driving prices down to cost are usually called barriers to entry. And Louis, could you give me some examples of barriers to entry?
Maybe Friedman's licensure example.
That's a great example.
Or government regulation.
Yeah, those are classic examples. If you have to comply with some regulations to enter, that can reduce firms' ability to enter. Doctors, taxi drivers, other licensed occupations have restricted entry to people who are licensed. But another example would be violence in illegal markets. So the job of a drug lord, you might think, is to produce drugs. But that's not really the job of a drug lord. That's like one of his least considerations. His main job is to keep other people from producing drugs, right? Because that's how he corners the market and keeps prices up, right? Another thing like this is harassment or bigotry can make it hard for firms to enter a market. Either because it's hard for them to serve their customers when people are coming around and harassing them, or because people boycott them. So a lot of minority-owned businesses had trouble entering because of that. Another example of this can be contractual arrangements that a large firm uses to keep small competitors out of the market. So one example of this was that in Peru, there's a company that controls 99.5% of the beer market. And they made arrangements with all of the stands along the beaches that sell beer that they could only carry their type of beer. And because lots of people spend a lot of time on the beach, a lot of the way they get to know the types of beer that they like is by going to the beach and buying beer there. And that can make it much harder for them to enter the beer market as a competitor. Yeah, go ahead.
Did they get such a big...
You're Matt Solomon, right? Yeah.
Did they get such a big market share before or after they made that arrangement?
Before. Okay. They bought up all the current companies, basically. And then beer prices went up, and then someone tried to enter, and then they kept them from entering by doing this. These types of barriers to entry are usually created by lobbying, violence, things like this. Economists usually call these activities rent-seeking, and we view them as harmful for three basic reasons. Charlie?
Yeah.
Oh, you're over there. Yeah, Charlie? What are the reasons why economists usually view rent-seeking as harmful?
One reason is that it's sort of economically inefficient, because instead of spending time producing a product, you're creating violence or doing these side arrangements.
Yeah, I think that's the most important reason. But it also creates a wedge between supply and demand, right, by reducing the supply into the market and thereby raising prices, right? So for both of those reasons, we think it's usually harmful. I want to claim that the reason that Charlie identified is by far the most important reason why we don't like rent-seeking. So otherwise, we wouldn't have intellectual property, right? Intellectual property creates all the same problems of restricting supply or benefiting one group over others, but it tends to be a social policy that a lot of economists support because it gives an incentive not to create violence, et cetera, but to create new products and innovations that are socially beneficial. In the absence of intellectual property in many industries, prices would be driven down to costs because of free entry. And that would make it very hard to recoup the costs of innovating in the first place. Now we're going to discuss that issue extensively in lecture 13, but the main point I want to make now is that whether barriers to entry are good or bad all depends on who receives the profits that they create and what those profits incentivize people to do. So if the rents from there being a drug monopoly go to whoever it was that killed enough people to get that monopoly, then it's really bad that there are monopoly profits to be earned from the drug trade, because it's going to create all sorts of violence, right? On the other hand, if I get a monopoly over your time because I'm a accomplished academic, that creates incentives for me to come up with great new ideas that can change the way we think about the economy, right? So another example of this, actually, there's a talk tonight, if you guys want to come to it, at 5:45 in the department, where someone's going to be talking about the value that's placed on authenticity in art, even though it can be really, really easy to reproduce the original artwork, maybe even better than the original person did it. And yet still people want to have the original Van Gogh, the original Michelangelo. That's a little bit strange, isn't it? That's basically a barrier to entry that's coming from people's preferences, right? That they want the original thing, even though they could get something that's really just as good, reproduced and painted by hand in Dafen village in China, which is what the person tonight's going to be talking about. That preference creates a barrier to entry, but it's probably beneficial because it encourages people to be artists and create artworks that are valuable to the world. Another example of this is intellectual property for end-of-life drugs, right? That encourages the creation of drugs that help extend people's lives. Now, usually people would say, oh, that's a great thing. I'm not so sure that that's really the case. The reason is, while it is beneficial to be able to extend people's lives, a lot of these end-of-life type treatments we're spending way too much on as a society. And I think the reason is that you sort of get locked in a very vicious game with your parents, because maybe grandma actually wants to die in a peaceful way, but she feels that if you aren't forcing her to stay alive, that means that you don't really love her that much, right? And therefore, people get locked into like the parents coercing the children to coerce them to do these end-of-life treatments that barely extend life and are incredibly painful. In fact, 50% of expenditures are in the last 6 months of a person's life. And so one policy that we could try to institute, or one political tactic you could try to institute to solve this problem, would be to be very populist about the whole thing. Say, look, it's fine for you to be earning a profit, having your monopoly, raising the price on stuff like Viagra or whatever. But on end-of-life stuff, every person has a right to buy that at cost, right? They have a right to get that end-of-life treatment at cost. Now, that sounds like very left-wing, populist, whatever, and you're going to, give access to health care to everyone. But the eventual consequence of that would be to reduce any incentive to innovate along that dimension, stopping all the costs from rising on this stuff, right? So sort of, if you were cynical about it, a way you could go about it is you could pretend like you're trying to encourage end-of-life treatment, when in the end, actually, you're trying to undermine the incentives to innovate in this area and create more stuff. OK. So regardless of whether these are good or bad, barriers to entry are sort of things that come from outside of the market that are imposed to restrict competition. And therefore, most economists in this traditional view assume that the market, sort of left to itself, would eliminate all the profits through free entry. This is one of the deepest and most cited economic ideas. And in some contexts, like intellectual property, things that intellectual property is applied to, it's probably right. But the number of contexts in which this is the right way to think about things, I think, is much more limited than it might appear to be at first. So the rest of the lecture is going to cover some of the natural limits to free entry. And these natural limits come from the fact that it requires talent, usually, to enter an industry. You have to be good at running a company.